Number 1.
In 1959, 6-year-old Carol Ann Stevens disappeared from the street outside her Cardiff home. Her tiny body was discovered weeks later in West Wales. Her family were left devastated, and her killer has never been found. And it remains among the most notorious unsolved murders in Welsh history. You can read more of them here. But now a team of former detectives and crime experts led by former Dyfed Police Chief Constable Jackie Roberts, who oversaw the investigation in the disappearance of murdered Welsh schoolgirl April Jones, has re-investigated the case, and they have identified new information related to a prime suspect in the case. They have uncovered more details linking a traveling salesman, who had links to both the cafe's area of the capital and the area where the body was found, to the case that sparked a nationwide safety campaign. 6 decades on from the murder that shocked the country, they believe the clues are still out there. Here is what they uncovered. For the Stevens family, April 7, 1959, began just like any another Tuesday. It was raining heavily in Cardiff, and shortly after midday, 6-year-old Carol Stevens was sent from her home to the corner shop to buy cigarettes for her mother Mavis. When she returned home, she couldn't wait to run back outside to play. But that was the last time her mother and stepfather Ken would see her alive. And, despite a frantic nationwide search, her killer was never found. 2 weeks after Carol's disappearance, her body was discovered in Carmarthenshire, 60 miles away from her home in Malafant Street, Cathays. But how did Carol, a young girl described as being tall and plump with a fresh complexion and rosy cheeks with brown hair and steel-rimmed glasses, end up dead and so far away from her Cardiff home? The family were known locally as friendly and hardworking, and Carol Ann was a happy, lively girl. Retired Detective Inspector Paul Bethel, who assisted Ms. Roberts in the re-investigation for crime documentary Darkland, Hunting the Killers, said she was described as a confident child, someone that would have no qualms about talking to someone, even a stranger. She was only 6 years old, so there is that innocence that every child that age has. She had been sent out by her mum to visit the local shop, not far from her home, to buy cigarettes and sweets. It was 1959. So sending your child to buy cigarettes would have been run-of-the-mill. Carol Ann visited the local shop in Dogfield Street, bought the cigarettes and sweets, and returned home. She then hastily, according to her mum, said she was going out to play. Her mum was cooking dinner at the time and told her not to be long, but she felt she was over-anxious to get back out. Ms. Roberts says, almost as if there had been a pre-arranged something that had prompted her to go back out. There was some evidence of what happened next from witnesses at the scene, including her friend Kevin Northcott, who actually lived in the same house as Carol Ann. He spoke to Carol Ann, and she told him she was going for a ride in a car. In 1959, there were very few cars and vehicles around, so this would have been a big deal for a child her age. Mr. Bethel explains, at the time Kevin described how he saw Carol Ann approach a car that was parked around the corner. It led detectives to ask if the man had been in touch with Carol Ann before she disappeared. Retired Di Bethel asks, was he planning this? Was he practicing? Was this an early form of grooming? On that day in April, Carol didn't come back, and by the middle of the afternoon, her worried mother had phoned the police. Between her disappearance and discovery of her body, there was a frantic nationwide search for the schoolgirl. Police from Cardiff were joined by detectives from Scotland Yard, and hundreds of people helped search for her. Her desperate mum issued an appeal saying, one thing I am sure of is that by now Carol will be crying for me. She is a friendly little girl and would talk to anyone, however much we discouraged her, but she didn't like being away from me for long. Detectives searched nearby woods, cafes, cemetery, and empty houses. They guarded Cardiff Central Station and watched passengers board the Fishguard boat train for Ireland. Then on April 22nd, 2 weeks after she was last seen, the search for Carol came to an end. Her 3 feet 6 inches body was found in a small ravine near the hamlet of Horeb in Carmarthenshire. It's thought that she had been dead for a week before being discovered in the stream, covered by overhanging leaves and branches. She was wearing the same outfit as the day she disappeared, but her now gray skirt was around her feet, and one of her light brown shoes was lying 5 feet away from her body. The other was found 15 feet downstream. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled before being dumped miles away from where she was taken. Police interviewed more than 10,000 people, searched 3,000 vehicles, and took more than 1,100 statements. But there were few clues to help detectives. At the time, Chief Constable Thomas told the South Wales Echo, "It's obvious Carol did not walk to Llanelli. Her abduction into a vehicle from the street where she lived coincided with an explosion of car ownership in Britain, and as concerns that killers could be using cars to abduct children mounted a nationwide public information stranger danger campaign was launched. The murder of Carol Ann was a driving force behind the adverts. In the early days of the investigation, detectives turned their attention to Carol's father and Mrs. Stevens' first husband James Lynch, who moved to London following their divorce 4 years earlier. Neighbor Brian Robson, who was child at the time, spoke to the re-investigation team and said, "She was just a normal girl and playful. Living there at the time was paradise. We did nothing but go to school and play. We were outside the house and playing all the time." Carol Ann was constantly going up to Robert Street corner, and she was always being told to get off the road and get back to her house. "We had 3 cars that were owned in the whole of the street, and there were 160 houses. So to see a car would have a turn up for the books. It was only after all this came about we realized that she was living with her stepfather and not a real father. There was talk at the time that her real father wanted her back." Mr. Lynch, who at the time was working as a bus driver and estranged from the family, went to a London police station after seeing an appeal in the newspaper urging him to come forward. The 33-year-old was interviewed by Metropolitan Police, but he hadn't seen his daughter and was able to prove he was in London at the time of her disappearance. Police turned their attention to the driver of the mysterious green car that had been seen parked up near Carol's house. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Carol had told her friends, "I have a new uncle who is taking me for lovely rides in his motor car." Police interviewed a neighbor who told them she had seen Carol get out of the car on April 1st or 2. The neighbor said they thought it was strange the driver had dropped her off around the corner and not outside her house. In April 1959, Mrs. Stevens told the South Wales Echo, "When I made inquiries, a neighbor told me about a strange man who was peering over the back garden wall at Carol's bedroom on Monday night. I was also told of occasions when neighbors and children saw her getting out of a strange man's car." A 16-year-old boy also said he had seen the car in the days leading up to Carol's disappearance, and said there had been a dark-haired man wearing a trench coat and brimmed hat inside reading some papers. Carol knocked on the car window. The teenager didn't take much notice and couldn't give police a full description of the car. Her friend and housemate, 6-year-old Kevin, liked collecting number plates. It's thought he nearly caught the man after collecting the number plates of all the cars in the area the day that Carol disappeared, but he didn't take the number of a green car where a man in his 30s was sat waiting near Carol's home. But despite repeated appeals from the police and from Carol's mother for the driver of the green car to come forward, he was never traced. The re-investigation team looked at newspaper reports from the time and looked at the link with the fact that Tuesdays at that time were markets days in Cardiff, and the area where Carol Ann was taken was close to what would have been one of the main routes out of the city. Her body was found little over a fortnight later. Mr. Bethel told the documentary, "Carol Ann's body was found in a water culvert in the hamlet of Horeb, about 5 miles from Llanelli in Carmarthenshire. That would be around 60 miles from Cardiff, where she was last seen. Her body was found lying in water. Her shoe was off and it was about 5 feet further downstream. Her second shoe was found even further downstream. Her skirt was around her ankles. The cause of death was never made clear." On Thursday, July 1st, an inquest into the death of Carol concluded. A verdict of murder by some person or persons was returned by the jury at the hearing in Llanelli. There were only about 7 or 8 houses in the hamlet with a pub and a chapel, and the only industry in the area was the brickworks factory. It was that factory that gave the team a lead in the documentary that is being shown on BBC Wales. Geographic profiler Dr. Siphamandla Madikane, who is part of the reinvestigation team, said, "There is a lot geographically that is interesting about this case. There is the distance that Carol Ann was transported, which is unusual, because crimes are usually a lot more local. We have someone who knows the area of Cardiff where she was living and would have spent time identifying a suitable victim. It is someone who felt comfortable using his car as a portable base. It is risky to take a child all that way, so it is someone who felt comfortable traveling long distances. It was also someone who must know the area of Horeb and would know that it is possible to dispose of a body in a particular area. It is somewhere only people with local knowledge would know that this is possible. I have never come across an offender who has just stumbled across somewhere." Spencer Hughes, a local historian in Horeb, helped the reinvestigation team uncover their next lead. He made them aware of a professional memoir in Welsh, written by Dyfed Police Detective Superintendent Roy Davies. It was read mainly by his family, but one section featured the murder of Carol Ann, which had been one of his first cases as an officer. The book was the only place he shared his true thoughts about the case, and he talked about how he interviewed a suspect called Ronald Edward Murray. His name had emerged when they checked the list of people who had worked at the J.P. Zamet brick factory in Horeb. He was one of many men interviewed in the case, but he aroused the suspicions of the young police officer. Mr. Davies said in the memoir, "This was the first murder case I worked on. Ronald Edward Murray lived with his wife in Lansomlet from January 1951 to April 1952. He worked as a steeplejack and steel erector at the brickworks in Horeb, situated just yards from where her body was found." It was a major turning point for the reinvestigation team, as they had a person of interest. He was originally from Australia and came to Wales after World War II, and he died in Penrith in 1973. A former neighbor was traced by the team who gave them some vital information. He spoke to Ms. Roberts on the phone and said, "Ron was living next door to us. Him and his wife, they both seemed like very, very nice people. He could make friends very easily, Ron could. He could lose them as well. He was a very charming man. He was charming to you in the beginning, but you got a bit suspicious because he used to tell a lot of lies. He used to buy and sell sweets. I don't think the car was his that he drove. I think he was probably using a company car. It wasn't a very big car, possibly something like a Morris Minor. The police took it when the little girl was found." Murray claimed to have had an alibi for the day Carol Ann went missing. His neighbor said, "What he said was he wasn't feeling well. He was ill when he was in Cardiff, and he went home and he hit a dog with his car. So he picked the dog up and put the dog in his car and drove home because he wasn't feeling well. When he got out of the car, he said the dog ran away, and he went to look for the dog. The only thing I can understand was that he was trying to account for his time. About 10 years later, his wife died in the lounge next door. I did say to my wife at the time, 'We'll keep him at arm's length.' I said that it sounded fishy to me." The team looked into the death of Mrs. Murray in her living room and found that the coroner recorded a verdict of accidental death, but the circumstances were very strange. The inquest heard that Ronald Murray claimed he found his wife Della dead in the living room, with an overpowering smell of gas. Murray then gave a convoluted explanation about the death of his wife. At the inquest, he said it was as a result of a trick he had been playing with his son that went horribly wrong. He told the hearing the trick involved him turning the gas on the hob off, and then he would ask his son to go and put the kettle on to make a cup of tea for his mum. When the stove wouldn't light, Murray would laugh and tease his son about not being man enough to make a cup of tea. Murray claimed the boy had tried to play the same trick on him, but mistakenly left the gas on. As a result, Della died with all blame placed on her son. Mr. Davies had continued to watch Murray, and when he heard about Della's death, he spoke to her relatives to find out what they think had happened. In his memoir, he said, "On hearing this story, the people who came to know Murray well suspected he planned the whole thing to get rid of Della. Murray was that cunning a man." The inquest into Della's death resulted in a verdict of accidental death, but her brother still writes to me from time to time. He has no doubt who is responsible for the death of his sister, or, for that matter, Carol Ann Stevens. As they reviewed all the information, the reinvestigation team uncovered some new evidence. They were able to pin down Murray as working for Carson's Chocolates in Bristol, and the company gave their workers green Morris minors. One of the places they delivered chocolates to was the Cathays area of Cardiff, where Carol Ann went missing. The most chilling new information of all is a previously unseen document from his employment record, where he asks his employers to give him more children's lines of chocolates and sweets. Former Chief Constable Ms. Roberts said if the case was taking place in 2020, they would be putting what they had found forward to the Crown Prosecution Service. Mr. Bethel said, "You would add into the pot the bizarre circumstances of the death of his wife, very suspicious death of his wife, and if it was today, we would be looking at that investigation, as it gives you a picture of him. In 1959 they called him the killer. They referred to him as the murderer. But we are in 1959. What we can say today is that he would be the prime suspect." A spokesman for South Wales Police said, "All historic murder cases remain under active consideration and will be subject of re-investigation as and when new information is received or when there are advances in forensic science. Cases are reviewed periodically, and if information comes in from the public or other forces, we act on it."
Number 2.
Siphamandla Madikane was a 10-year-old boy from the Ramaphosa informal settlement in South Africa. On Sunday the 3rd of November, 2013, power was out in the area, so Siphamandla and his mother, Nakyukanya, went to the nearby store to purchase some paraffin. While at the store, Nakyukanya bumped into some of his friends and asked if he could play with them. His mother agreed. However, when he hadn't returned home by 7 p.m. that evening, his parents reported him missing and began conducting their own search, assisted by other members of the community. According to Siphamandla's friends, there was a man who had been watching them play for quite some time, and then approached them. He asked the group of boys to go and call his girlfriend for him, and offered whoever agreed R5. 3 of the boys refused, but Siphamandla agreed and walked off with the anonymous man, never to return. The following morning, a missing person report was filed at Rikki police station. At around 2 p.m., Nathaniel Malaho, who lived a few kilometers away from the Madikane family, went to relieve himself in a bush. Since there was no water in the toilets, hidden among the bushes, he saw small legs. Terrified, he ran to get 2 local men who returned to the scene to investigate. What they found would traumatize them. It was the semi-naked and burnt body of Siphamandla. His pants and underwear were pulled down, and he had been stabbed in the neck and then set on fire. A pair of socks had been stuffed into his mouth, and a used condom was discarded beside his body. Following the grim discovery, Siphamandla's parents would publicly state that when they reported him missing, police ignored them. Spokesman for the police, Captain Sikiso Mofokeng, claimed that the family had not reported him missing until Monday. However, Siphamandla's family said that this was untrue. Thad reported him missing on Sunday evening and had conducted their own search for him. They said that police had never shown up. Captain Mofokeng said that they would be investigating the actions of the police and would later confirm that the family had reported Siphamandla missing on the Sunday. A Ekurhuleni mayor, Mondli Gungubel, offered to pay for the funeral of Siphamandla, stating that it was the least the municipality could do to ensure he receive a decent burial. He said, "In fact, as I got the gory details of the incident, I felt shivers going down my spine, wondering how another person can carry out such a brutal attack on a helpless boy." Sadly, the case went cold, and the following year, Siphamandla's family took part in the DA march to the national headquarters of the South African Police Service, SAPS. They held signs which read, "Enough is enough." The march was intended to highlight the need for the restructuring of the police service, as well as the provision of better services to communities ravaged by crime. The family said that while a year had passed, there had been no progress in the murder case. His sister, Bonjo Madikane, said, "My brother's body was found on November 4th, and only after calling numerous times were we told last month that there is an investigator working on the case. We ask them why they don't communicate with us, and no one can answer us." There had been a spate of attacks on children across the country in the recent months. Also in attendance at the march was the parents of 3-year-old Cuburn Lavin Van Wyck, who was found murdered and burnt at a mine dump in the Ramaphosa informal settlement, around 9 months after Siphamandla was killed. His killer, Nathaniel Kitlegompoku, was arrested on the 31st of October, Gauding Premier David Makora pledged that the murder would be solved, stating, "Child killers will be brought to book and will face the law." He also said that they were going to be looking into whether the murder of Siphamandla and Cuburn were somehow linked due to the similarities. As the months transformed into years, the case just went colder and colder. Despite the fact that a plethora of evidence was left behind, nobody has ever been arrested for Siphamandla's murder. Mpoku was convicted of Cuburn's murder, and Siphamandla's mother attended each day of the trial, hoping that he would confess to murdering her son as well. That confession, however, never came, and he has never been implicated in the murder. The murder of Siphamandla Madikane remains unsolved today, but his family still hold out hope that one day it will be solved and justice will be served. Nakukanya has said, "I've been praying that Mandla can fight for himself from the grave and show us who killed him."
Number 3.
By the time she reached the age of 14, Michelle Garvey was well known to local authorities in New London, Connecticut. The troubled young teen frequently ran away from home, so when she vanished 2 days before her 15th birthday on June 1, 1982, there was little reaction from her family at first. It was presumed that red-haired Michelle was planning on starting a new life back in her birth state of New Jersey, something she often talked about. As time went on and there was no contact from Michelle, her family reported the disappearance to the authorities, and some appeals for information were put out. However, with little information as to where she had gone, and given that she was prone to disappearing, there was not much to be done. Michelle's family presumed that she was living a new life in a different state, and hoped that she was happier wherever she was. When 14-year-old Michelle Garvey left her family's home in 1982, she was hoping to return to a former life amid her friends. Streetwise beyond her tender years, Michelle was no stranger to time on the road. This latest disappearance was just one of many times she had attempted to start her life over again. The teenager headed out of the state on her journey back to New Jersey, although along the way it appears that she ended up in Texas. Why she took this route and what happened along the way is unknown. On July 1, 1982, authorities in Baywater, Texas, discovered the body of a young female, estimated to be in her late teens. The red-haired youngster had been strangled and her body dumped in a field. A case into her death was immediately opened, but as police were unable to link the victim to any known records and identify her, they had a tough time knowing who to suspect of her murder. The body was found just 1 year after another unsolved murder had stunned Texan officials. A young man had been beaten to death and a young woman strangled. Both had been concealed in woodland near to where this latest victim had been discovered, and both also remained unidentified. The three were eventually buried together, and their cases closed pending further information. Almost 30 years later, in 2011, an unlikely break was made in the unsolved murder case. Through the internet, details of cold cases are now readily available, and a keen amateur detective was taking a look at Texan murder cases one evening when something caught her eye. The artist's reconstruction of the Texas victim was very similar to pictures of a missing child who had vanished shortly before the murder occurred. Could they be the same person? Keen to help, the hobbyist sleuth contacted authorities immediately and told them her thoughts. It was 2014 before the breakthrough was finally made. DNA taken from Michelle Garvey's brother was matched to that of the murder victim, and it was proved conclusively that the body was indeed Michelle's. After grabbing vital evidence, the teenager's body was returned to her family in Connecticut and laid to rest for the last time. How Michelle Garvey came to be in Texas is still a mystery, and authorities are no closer to learning who brutally strangled the young teen. They also do not know if her death is linked to the other two murders. The case to catch Michelle's killer is ongoing. Meanwhile, her family are left with their worst fears, confirmed Michelle never did start that new life she wanted, but instead had hers snatched cruelly from her by a sadistic killer.
Number 4.
A fantasist has been found guilty of murdering schoolboy Rikki Neave, finally ending a 27-year mystery. A jury deliberated for 36 hours and 31 minutes to convict 41-year-old James Watson by a majority verdict of 10-2, following an 11-week trial at the Old Bailey. Rikki's sister Rochelle Neave, 30, hailed the verdict as a victory for the family who had campaigned for justice. She said, "He thought he'd got away with it for that many years, and thought we were just going to go away and roll under the table. We weren't. She remembered her brother as a cheeky and loving boy who would look after his siblings. Youngest sister Sheridan Neave, 27, who was a baby when Rikki died, added, "I think we were let down by the police at the time. We were let down by social services. We were let down by everyone who was in our lives who was meant to care." The verdict will also come as long-awaited vindication for Rikki's mother Ruth Neave, who was cleared of killing her son in 1996. Sentencing is set to take place on May 9th at the same court. The judge, Mrs. Justice McGowan, said, "He will fall to be sentenced for something he did at the age of 13. The sentence for murder is one of life imprisonment. I have to set the minimum term he must serve before he can be considered for release. It will be determined largely by the age he was at the time of the offense he committed." The judge thanked the jury for their dedication, commitment, and hard work over 3 months, and for their great civic service. The defendant was not in court, but was watching the verdict on a video link. Watson lured 6-year-old Rikki to woods near his home in Peterborough on November 28, 1994. He strangled the boy from behind with a ligature or anorak collar to fulfill a morbid fantasy he had told his mother about 3 days before. He stripped Rikki and posed his naked body in a star shape for sexual gratification, deliberately exhibiting him near a children's woodland den. Jurors were told. Rikki was reported missing that evening by Ms. Neave and found the next day. Watson obsessed over newspaper coverage of the killing, copying front-page stories at school. The next month, he was interviewed as a witness by police, after an elderly resident reported seeing him with Rikki on the nearby Welland estate. His lying account was unchallenged as police wrongly focused on a theory Ms. Neave killed her son and used a buggy to dump his body. Ms. Neave, a mother of 4, was cleared of Rikki's murder in 1996, but jailed for 7 years after admitting child cruelty. The case was unsolved for more than 20 years, until Watson's DNA was identified on Rikki's clothes, which had been recovered from a wheelie bin. Prosecutors felt there was still insufficient evidence, but reversed their decision after Ms. Neave and Rikki's sisters called for a victim's right to review. Key evidence included Rikki's last meal of Weetabix, which fixed his time of death at around noon. It meant Rikki was killed shortly after being seen with Watson heading to the woods where he used to play. Rikki's muddy Clark's shoes also indicated his walk into the woods was a one-way trip. The prosecution claimed it was no coincidence that 3 days before the murder, Watson was the source of a bogus radio report about a 2-year-old boy being strangled. Watson's sexual interest in younger boys was known to police, who interviewed him over an allegation he molested a 5-year-old in 1993. More disturbing behavior was noted at Watson's children's home, including him masturbating over pictures of young boys in underwear and keeping a dead pheasant in his room. The court heard. Jurors were not told about a record of Watson allegedly throttling a staff member with a stocking. An ex-girlfriend revealed he had strangled her during sex in woods and killed a bird, and spread its wings in a sinister reconstruction of Rikki's murder. In a police interview in 2016, Watson attempted to explain his DNA's presence on Rikki's clothes by claiming he picked him up to look at diggers through a hole in a fence. Prosecutor John Price QC said that was his really big mistake, as police were able to prove the fence was not there in 1994. Jurors were told Watson has a long criminal record, which includes convictions for stealing cars and setting fire to a British transport police station. While on bail on suspicion of murder, Watson fled to Portugal but was extradited back to Britain. In his defense, Watson's legal team pointed the finger of suspicion at Ms. Neave, which she denied. The defense asserted Watson could not have murdered Rikki, as he was seen alive in the afternoon of November 28. However, the prosecution shrugged off the ghost sightings, which wrongly claimed Rikki was wearing a red jumper or riding a BMX bike. Following the verdict, former Assistant Chief Constable Paul Fullwood, who led the cold case, said Watson is a fantasist, a dangerous individual, and a compulsive liar. Mr. Fullwood said, "All the way through this, it's been a monumental series of challenges. But as far as we're concerned, we've got the right person responsible for the dreadful, dreadful murder of that little boy Rikki Neave. Hopefully, we can bring some justice for his family, and also make sure that we put a dangerous individual in prison." Hannah Van Delsen, Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutor for the East of England, acknowledged prosecuting Ms. Neave was wrong. She said, "I am pleased that we have been able to deliver justice for all those who knew and loved Rikki, and I hope that for all those people that does bring a sense of closure to the case."
Number 5.
Clare Morrison was 13 in 1992 when she was brutally murdered by an unknown assailant. She lived in Geelong, Victoria, Australia, a port city that's about 75 kilometers, 46.6 miles, southwest of Melbourne, the state's capital. At the time of her murder, Clare was beginning to go through a rebellious phase. She'd recently picked up smoking. The last time her brother saw her, she'd been smoking a cigarette in their backyard. Sometimes she drank alcohol as well. However, neither smoking nor drinking alcohol was considered particularly unusual for a teen at the time. Clare was last seen alive on the night of December 18, 1992. She had been at the Geelong Mall with her friends. She'd told them that she was going to catch a bus home to get some money for Christmas shopping. This would be the last time they saw her alive. 2 witnesses saw her walking down Little Mallop Street in the direction of Moorabool Street, apparently under the influence of alcohol. She was supposed to meet a friend at a nearby McDonald's. On the morning of December 19, 1992, Clare Morrison's body was found in the early morning near Bells Beach. Bells Beach is about 25 kilometers, 15.5 miles, south of Geelong. It's a beach well known in the area as a good surfing spot. Clare's body was beaten, strangled, shark-bitten, and nearly nude. She'd suffered head and neck injuries prior to her death. Unfortunately, due to also having mangled by a shark, the exact cause of death couldn't be determined. An 18-year-old, Shane McLaren, reported that Clare got into a blue Holden Comber with 2 men. Police spent months looking for this car. However, they were never able to find it. This was because McLaren's report was false. McLaren remains the only suspect in the murder. McLaren was jailed for perjury due to his false police report. However, he remains adamant that he didn't kill Clare. When asked about the murder for a current affair, he says he was just a friend of hers who occasionally smoked cigarettes with her. He claims that he only made the report about the blue Commodore to get out of trouble with the police. In just about every source I found talking about McLaren, they bring up that he was addicted to ice, what Americans call crystal meth. He'd even been an interview subject of a current affair story about people addicted to the drug. It was that interview which would bring the case to their attention. Someone had recognized him as being a person of interest in the murder of Clare Morrison. As of 2020, the Victorian State Police are offering a reward of $50,000 for information that could lead to solving Clare's murder. This potential reward hasn't been increased since it was first offered during the 1990s, much to the frustration of the Morrison family. Her family are still active on social media, working to find information about the case. They run a Facebook page called Justice for Clare Morrison. Unfortunately, there's still not a whole lot of information publicly available online about this case. The police had lost valuable time investigating the case due to McLaren's false report, and this was one case the media wasn't interested in reporting on.